Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today we welcome back Yaël Ossowski. He is a Bitcoin advocate and somebody that we are relying on for the specific regulatory issues going on in the US. Yaël, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick.
Let's start with the strategic Bitcoin reserve. It is all the news right now. We are less than 2 weeks away from Inauguration Day. There's a lot of uncertainty. What do you have for us, the latest on the strategic Bitcoin reserve, if anything?
Well, we have the Bitcoin Act that was put forward by Senator Cynthia Lummis. This was introduced into the last Congress. She'll have another opportunity to introduce it, to kind of let it go through the Senate and kind of have a congressional mandate on that. I guess the only update for now is that there are executive orders that have been prepped to put on President Trump's desks. There's all kinds of different mechanisms that he would be able to use in current and existing law that would actually help trigger at least the first part of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So from everything that I've been hearing, this is one avenue that the team is looking at. Not 100% sure because it's going to be a big whirlwind the first couple of days that Trump is actually inaugurated in office. He's going to have many different things that he's going to be looking to sign and do by executive order. SBR is one of those options. So we're maybe leaning towards that. It'd be very favorable towards Bitcoin and Bitcoin holders. And we just have to see what happens. But there's a lot of competing interests. There's a lot of different things being placed on the desk. If we can get SBR, at least one version of it, that would be really interesting. So that's about all I have on that. But there is some work behind the scenes being done there.
As Bitcoin's role in the global financial landscape evolves, understanding its potential impact on your wealth becomes increasingly crucial. Whether we see a measured adoption or accelerated hyper-Bitcoinization, being prepared for various scenarios can make the difference between merely participating and truly optimizing your position. This is why Unchained developed the Bitcoin Calculator, a sophisticated modeling tool that helps you visualize and prepare for multiple Bitcoin futures. Beyond traditional retirement planning, it offers deep insight into how different adoption scenarios could transform your wealth trajectory. What sets this tool apart is that it's integrated with Unchained IRA, the only solution that combines the tax advantages of a retirement account with self-custody of Bitcoin. In any future state, maintaining control of your Bitcoin keys remains fundamental to your Bitcoin strategy. Explore your potential futures at unchained.com/TBL. Don't write your seed on paper. It's estimated that so much Bitcoin is lost forever, and the main culprit, the main reason, is poor seed phrase security. This is why we use Stamp Seed, a DIY kit that enables you to hammer your seed phrases into titanium plates using professional stamping tools. These plates are heat resistant up to 3,000 degrees, fireproof, crush-proof, and time-proof. They're compact and easy to hide, and they can be used in your single sig or multi-sig setups. Make sure you go check them out today at stampseed.com and use code TBL for 15% off of your order. There's talk about a 51st and a 52nd state. Trump landed in Greenland today, and he announced that he is changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. So yes, a lot of changes coming in the first few days of the new White House. I want to ask you about Michael Saylor really quickly. We saw Saylor meet with Trump's son. This is not an idea that I had over the last few weeks, that what if Saylor himself is already building the strategic Bitcoin reserve on behalf of the US government in some perverse way? Is that something that you've thought about? What does it mean that Saylor's MicroStrategy is an American domiciled company? And what do you take away from the latest meeting between a member of the Trump family and Michael Saylor?
I think it's an interesting idea. Definitely one thing about the United States is, we don't really have too many state-owned industries. We're not much like Germany or the UK with its NHS. We're not really something that we dominate with federal ownership of something. So that's kind of why a strategic Bitcoin reserve is something that is a bit unique and would be more about commodities and resources. But you bring up an interesting point. Basically, if you look at the value of the American economy, which anyone can invest in throughout the world, if you look at any matter of ETFs, you do that through American capitalism and firms. You do that through companies that provide value, that are based in the United States, that pay taxes in the United States, have boards based in the United States, are listed on American stock exchanges. And what Michael Saylor has done, and many other companies that are following, is they're building Bitcoin backed businesses. And they are leaving them right now in the United States. I'd argue there's a lot of regulatory pressure to push them out if we don't change things. Things are getting a bit more positive. But it is a way to show that the might of the American economy is also tied to Bitcoin's fate. So it is definitely a strength, and it's something that's good for Bitcoin and Bitcoin holders and those of us who believe in that economy, because it means that there are actually large financial actors that want to be a part of this. And it's not just Sailor, it's not just the ETFs, but also the ability to use it, which I know we've talked about before. But if that's sort of the third peg of this that we're always going to need to have, is to ensure that, yes, we're going to have greatly capitalized companies through Bitcoin, that there are going to be all kinds of different financial products tied to that, ETF, stabilization things, bonds. But if we're not able to use it at the end of the day, if we're not able to use it and not have to pay taxes through the wazoo, end up in jail because we're not doing something correctly, that would be a big issue. So I think one thing that we're always pushing to have are these good concrete reforms so that people can still use Bitcoin. It's not just seen as some kind of digital gold that's best left to kind of company treasuries. We need to ensure that holders, those who have Bitcoin in self custody as well, are going to be able to participate as well.
Are there any developments from the US regulatory front over the last couple weeks? We saw the resignation of Michael Barr this week. Is there anything that you've been watching here that suggests pro Bitcoin regulatory policies are already happening, even though we're still a couple weeks shy of the new Trump administration?
You've definitely seen it in the Congress. So the House Financial Services Committee, this is the big committee really talking about financial regulation, and has been basically the committee over the last few years that's talked a lot about stablecoins, about some kind of digital assets framework. And the incoming head of this will be French Hill, who's a representative from Arkansas. He's a big proponent of community banks and also cryptocurrencies generally, also Bitcoin. His staff has actually now taken up all the major planks on this committee, and he said day one they're going to put something forward. We don't know exactly what it would be. Is it going to be stablecoins first? Is it going to be some kind of crypto regime? I don't think it really matters. There just need to be some positive moves. The last head of that committee, Patrick McHenry, who was formerly my congressman in North Carolina, he had put together a really earnest proposal. He had talked a lot about stablecoins, but he was just stuck negotiating with the Democrat Maxine Waters, who's the Democrat head of that committee. And a lot of stuff just took forever. I think French Hill is really starting out of the gate. He already knows exactly what he wants to do. There's already a couple of proposed bills, and there's already a lot of very smart, capable staff members that are going to take that over the finish line. So I think there, from a just general regulatory position, is really good and should be quite nice. There is going to be a shakeup amongst all the other regulatory agencies as well, looking at SEC, looking at particularly, hopefully, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's a whole other debanking angle that we can cover. But I think there are a good number of change of ideology that's happening throughout the town. It might take a couple of weeks for us to kind of see until the dust settles, because again, there are going to be a lot of actions, and then we still need some confirmations for the executive branch. But at least through the legislative branch, it seems as if people are really excited about pushing something that would at least make it so that many different Bitcoin and cryptocurrency companies don't have to go overseas and go to, who knows, the Seychelles, Switzerland, or Dubai. So
And
that's at least a positive thing.
that's the very important America first mentality that the new administration wants to have. It doesn't want activities to leave the country, and that includes Bitcoin. So instead of thinking of the Trump administration as some grand pro Bitcoin administration, it's actually focused on nationalist policies and being competitive with the rest of the world. And that means trying to bring activity back or keep it in the United States. We obviously know that the American energy around Bitcoin is amongst the strongest in the world. I want to ask you about the what's going on north of the border. I know that you yourself are a Canadian national. So, what is your reaction to the news of Trudeau's resignation, specifically with regard to Bitcoin, financial privacy, and financial freedom?
Yeah, there's been so much that's happened with this prime minister having Justin Trudeau be at the top for so long. Obviously, there's been a lot of economic issues, just terrible trade policies, not very good for just the average consumer. But specific to Bitcoin, they never really clarified anything. And you've just had a lot of demonization of specifically Bitcoin, but also cryptocurrencies. We saw that as well with the trucker convoy, the freedom convoy that happened during COVID. And you had at that time the Minister of Finance freezing people's accounts, repoing their cars, their tow trucks, and then they were also blacklisting various Bitcoin addresses that Caribou, who's the sort of Bitcoin advocate there, who is giving Bitcoin out to the truckers, they were blacklisting all of the different addresses that they found. So any trucker who received any of that Bitcoin and went to an exchange to try to sell it would immediately get a call from the police and then get all of his accounts frozen. So the Liberal Party that has now been in charge of Canada for over 9 years, since 2015, they just haven't been very friendly at all towards Bitcoin or any other crypto offspring. And I think Justin Trudeau was basically trying to always make fun of the opposition leader, who was Pierre Poilievre from the Conservative Party, always saying that Pierre Poilievre was too much into Bitcoin, which is really interesting, saying that that is the Conservatives' plan, is everybody just invest in Bitcoin. This was happening, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was really fascinating to be a Canadian Bitcoiner and hearing that, because you're like, well, yeah, obviously, great idea, wonderful. It'd be great if other people did this too. But kind of Trudeau brought it to this absurd level, and you had FTX at the time, prices were going down. But I think with Trudeau out of the way now, there's a lot more optimism and hope. One thing that Canada has, much like the U.S., is tons of energy. We've had a lot of great Bitcoin mining firms in Canada that have been established for a long time, but they've had to deal with a declining Canadian dollar. They've had to deal with much higher energy prices with carbon taxes. So they haven't been able to take advantage of the Bitcoin economy like we have in the United States. So it would actually be a very good opportunity. We still have many months. It's probably not going to be at least April, maybe June at the earliest, where there could be a new election, and you could have perhaps Pierre Poilievre, who's the Conservative leader, go in there. But overall, I think it's a good thing. We have a very strange system in Canada based on the Brits. We kind of keep this parliamentary democracy going, but people are there a very long time. And 9 years throughout inflation, throughout COVID, throughout everything bad has been very long on the Canadian people. And I really am looking forward for just something new. Any kind of breath of fresh air that we can have in the Maple Republic up north, I think is very good.
In the United States and in Canada, you've had headwinds to Bitcoin adoption. It doesn't mean that Bitcoin adoption stops or even slows down, but the pace of adoption has been slowed at the margin by these two governments and by rhetoric coming out of the government. So when you remove them, you remove a headwind. Will there be a tailwind? Maybe. And we are projecting, so the price itself is projecting that there will be a tailwind. But the main point here is that without the headwind, optimism can creep back into Bitcoin, and this arbitrary bureaucratic hurdle really gets removed. And that's something that we'll be watching for. During the Biden term, you basically had Bitcoin doubling despite all of these things going against it. So what will a pro Bitcoin administration throughout North America mean? It's something that we're going to be watching for sure. Now, I want to ask you about net neutralities. Let's shift gears a little bit to the internet, freedom of speech, the First Amendment is something that we talked about in our last visit. Talk about the latest with the Loper Bright case, net neutrality, and if you could just start from the beginning.
All right. Well, the tale of net neutrality is an interesting one. It's obviously something that sounds great neutrality on the internet, nothing being discriminated against, everything being treated as well, and essentially no company is allowed to discriminate against my traffic. But it's actually a lot more insidious to that, and we could really have to go back to around 2013, 2014. This is throughout the Obama administration. And back then, you had the FCC. Their plan was that they're going to take the internet and internet service providers, and we're going to regulate them under Title II. Title II of the Communications and Decency Act essentially would make it that ISPs, those who provide you internet, would be common carriers. Essentially, they are sort of public-private entities rather than just private companies that provide internet. Now, what did that mean overall? It would mean that the government would have much more regulatory force by law to mandate that certain content be blocked, that certain pipes be laid so that internet be brought to a certain place. It was a way for the government to take a bit more control of the internet. And they implemented this during Barack Obama's time. Once Trump came into power, him and his FCC through Ajit Pai, they got rid of it. And then through the Biden administration, here just recently, just a couple of months ago, they reinstituted net neutrality. And a lot of people might remember 2015, 2016, if you went on Reddit, reddit.com, they had the entire page black. And they say, if we don't have net neutrality, we're going to have paid toll lanes, and we're not going to allow anybody to surf the internet without paying per website used. It was all these scare stories. And, now nobody really talks about it anymore. But it really was a huge propaganda move back then that different entities had because they didn't want to try to really pay a certain amount, or they wanted to have government to have a certain number of controls and mechanisms so that they could actually implement things that they wanted. And what we saw recently was a case that went through the 6th district. And in this case, net neutrality, the recent decision by the Democrat-led FCC, they said, okay, we're revising this case. And we're seeing that the agency actually does not have the authority, according to the new Loper-Bright case, meaning the Chevron doctrine. The Chevron doctrine is the idea that judges have to sort of bow to whatever an agency interpretation of a rule is, rather than the original legislation from Congress. And what the court deemed in this case is that the FCC didn't have the power to implement net neutrality. It would have to be something done by Congress. Now, the Chevron doctrine was something passed in the summer by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's slowly rolling back regulatory agency power, which I think is very good for individual freedom, definitely good for freer markets, but also very good for financial innovation and Bitcoin as well. When we see a lot of these agencies, SEC, FCC, you name any of them, FDA, they've gone beyond the remit of what Congress allowed them to do. And by reining in, particularly the net neutrality case, I think it's very good for internet freedom. It gets the government out of the way and make sure that we can continue having safe internet that is competitive, private, and will have no government regulation like, let's say, the Chinese wall. So overall, a very good thing. Glad that the Chevron doctrine is here to stay, and even more excited to see what this will mean for future cases and future regulatory regimes going forward.
Yes, the idea that the regulatory state has gained a lot of power over the last several decades because of one single case, all of that has the potential to now get reversed. And when Chevron was reversed last year, we thought that it might set a good precedent for Bitcoin regulation, and that you wouldn't have these arbitrary rules. And that word arbitrary played very, very importantly in this current Bitcoin bull market, because people will remember in October of 2023, the federal judicial system ruled that Grayscale was being treated in an arbitrary and capricious way by the SEC. And that was the case that allowed ETFs to be allowed. It was only a couple months after that case that the SEC finally handed down their ruling and allowed BlackRock, Fidelity, and the rest to legalize their ETFs. We now have Bitcoin ETF options on IBIT specifically, the BlackRock ETF being one of the most widely used options in the entire financial market. So something that we definitely want to keep our eyes on. All right, so with regard to net neutrality, the Chevron doctrine, and the way that these regulations potentially could be rolled back, let's apply this to Bitcoin. Obviously, we have the Operation Choke Point 2.0 efforts that will be rolled back. But what are some other specific regulations that might be targeted here in a reduced administrative state?
Definitely the number one target to look at is Department of the Treasury and seeing essentially anything that they've considered money laundering that perhaps wasn't, looking at whether or not people are required to have money transmission licenses. Hello, Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash. So I think these are two instances where if you had a very smart and a very well thought out lawsuit for people with standing, you could actually go against some of the agency interpretations and guidance. Definitely FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We had in the last couple of years, we've had these essentially pseudo bank runs that happened in front of our very eyes. You had Silvergate Bank, you had everything with all the banks being told if you hold any kind of cryptocurrencies, essentially you're running afoul of the law or the rules. We're getting a bit more of this information now just from freedom of information requests from FDIC. But in any of these particular circumstances, if they're deviating from what Congress laid out as law, that is grounds for a lawsuit. And knowing this Supreme Court, knowing particularly the good justices like Neil Gorsuch, I know he'd be very happy to weigh in on that and to slap the hands of many of the agency bureaucrats that have allowed this to happen. So definitely FDIC, definitely a lot of stuff at Treasury, IRS as well. IRS, we discussed in the last episode a little bit about how they classify Bitcoin and some of the transactions, and they've had their own things they've been doing here recently. They're kind of drawing their own rules right now, and not necessarily things that Congress has allowed them to do, nor told them to do. And these are the circumstances where if you can prove some kind of injury, it would be perfect for the US court system and a lawsuit. And then you could apply Chevron doctrine directly to that, and you would have a very favorable ruling. It's still a bit too early, but I know there's a lot of stuff with taxation, with IRS. We have the case of Roger Ver. Obviously, this is a sort of a very important one for a lot of early Bitcoiners because a lot of stuff back then wasn't very clear about your kind of crypto gains and buying and selling and things like that. But I think these are kind of the prime opportunity areas that would make very good grounds for a lawsuit. We hope that in the next administration, knowing this also means that they will be curtailed, that they won't make wild interpretations. Trump is not 100% good on everything. So there could be areas where having Chevron doctrine in place and really being able to constrain that regulatory state would definitely be good for human freedom and individual liberty in the United States. But I presume it will also continue to extend for Bitcoin as well, which would be good for everyone.
And when it comes to the IRS specifically, are there knock-on implications for the rest of the world? My question is around the idea that now that the US is no longer in an anti-Bitcoin regulatory stance, even if it doesn't go full strategic Bitcoin reserve, you're starting to hear things from other parts of the world. They are realizing that this Bitcoin thing needs to be taken more seriously at the national level, not just as a technology project that's leading to speculation and financial activity.
Yeah, I think definitely with if we look at de minimis exemption, something that we talked about before, you have people who are using Bitcoin to get their hair cut or to buy coffee or to pay certain contractors. And according to the current IRS rules, these are taxable events that will have to be matched to the price that you acquired that Bitcoin, and you're supposed to be charged the capital gains rate based upon that. And the IRS is already implementing this. This has kind of been the status quo. They haven't talked about layer 2 and lightning or anything else yet, though that's kind of implied. But what it means for the world is that, every other country is just going to implement the same thing. And the IRS obviously is probably the most well-funded tax agency, collection agency in the world. They know what they're doing. I actually went to a conference in London. It was the FT Crypto Conference. I believe it was in May. And I met a number of people who were from the IRS criminal division. To my surprise, these are Bitcoiners. They run nodes. They know what coin joins are, and they follow the technology. They kind of mine in their garages, but they have to execute the law, and they have to figure out ways of people who might be tax cheats or people who might be breaking the law. They have to figure out how they can go after them. So it's really interesting that you have these people in the apparatuses of, let's say, IRS or some of these other agencies. And what they're doing is setting a precedent for many other countries. One country that I talked about, I believe last time, in a positive way, is the Czech Republic. Czech Republic and Slovakia usually have been more open to Bitcoin throughout the years. They're looking at a bill right now that would completely eliminate capital gains tax, if you've held for more than 3 years, which is exactly what we need and would be great in the United States and elsewhere. But if the IRS, chooses a path where every Bitcoin spend and every transaction in the mempool is a taxable event that you're going to have to file with an accountant, it's kind of status quo right now, but that's just not a way that we're going to grow what we think is Satoshi's greatest innovation. So that is something that definitely would have to be addressed. And if not just for Americans, also for the rest of the world. Because every other tax collection authority would love to learn from the United States, would love to buy chain analysis software and to implement that and have that be the norm. But that is something to where America has to stand for not only their own rights, but also the rights of our own republic to be able to push back against that more tyrannical view of trying to limit free enterprise and free exchange. And the American model is the best place to not only propel Bitcoin, but also to defend it and to ensure that self-custody and the ability to run our node, the ability to send and receive, it's part of our natural rights that have to be respected. So if we continue to do that through our agencies, through every single process, people continue standing up and still doing whatever they want without the government's permission, that's a good thing. And we have to keep doing that because many other countries are not going to be as lucky and aren't going to have the same rule of law that we'll have in a place like the US.
Color me naive, Yael, but sometimes when people say, well, the U.S. government is going to stop Bitcoin, the U.S. government is the U.S. people. And I feel that that might be a naive stance, especially with how much power the government has. But the government does, in the United States, does have to face a vote every 2 years. And in that way, the people can change the government. And I feel like that is happening right now. And your point that IRS agents themselves are node operators and garage miners it does capture what I'm trying to explain here, which is that the American government is an amalgamation of Americans. And if those Americans decide that this is the way forward, then that's going to be the way forward. So do you share any of that optimism, or where am I naive there? And what's your outlook now that we've discussed, what's going on with this administration change? What is your outlook for Bitcoin in the US here for the next few years?
No, I think I share your optimism. I mean, for a lot of people, many of us who've been more favorable to, let's say, third parties have decried the duopoly and the sort of ideological meshing between traditionally the Democrat and Republican parties, and particularly when it comes to the issues that people cared about, war and peace, free markets, things like this, they were just kind of conjoined at the hip. But as you're saying, with this new government, with Trump, with the Congress that's ready and willing to basically do anything Trump says, whether it be Greenland, Canada, or any other rule, it is a big momentum shift. And this is the kind of the great thing about the private market is that the market always has to respond. And a good example right now is Meta. So Mark Zuckerberg announced recently they're not going to have any more of their sort of human moderators. They're going to have a community notes function similar to X and Twitter. And that is really just a pure market response. It is a fear of Trump and the sort of more Republicans who've gone against Facebook and Meta for many years. But it also shows that, like, look, this is what the people want and what the people demand. And the US government has to be responsive to that. When you looked at everything that happened with Obamacare, you go back, all those years throughout the Obama regime, there was a lot of stuff that they were doing incorrectly. And what did they do? The Tea Party rolled into town, and there was a big change. Wasn't as organized as we probably would have hoped, but it's true that there was a sea change and things were different. It just seems that this happened to coincide exactly the same time as Bitcoin's rise and the ability for so many of us to be able to use this, adopt it, and really live on a Bitcoin standard. I mean, we're going to have a vice president of the United States who already now has more Bitcoin than anybody stacking now will probably ever be able to achieve. So there's definitely a lot of different players and different incentives now. It's just a different game. And I think that people did speak. And at least for the next 2 years, we're just got to make sure that they follow through on that.
While a Bitcoiner might not be the one person running the country, he is surrounded by several true and hardcore Bitcoiners. Yaël Ossowski, thank you so much once again for sharing your expertise. We appreciate it. Please tell people where they can find your great policy work, especially as we head into some of these potential executive orders.
So absolutely, I'd point people over actually to the rage.co. I had an article there about the IRS, and everything else is just at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and then anything else sort of tech freedom, net neutrality, and Chevron doctrine. Thanks for mentioning that. It's over there on Consumer Choice Center. You can find that everywhere and on Nostr as well. So thanks so much for having me.
Of course, and we'll catch you guys next time.